Yesterday we had a really nice day for sharing the Dharma Day, and we thought a lot about how to develop bodhicitta and the things that get in the way of it. And so I thought, had a really good opportunity to look at and identify where we have self-centered thought that's getting in the way, but in a way that didn't really kind of pull you down. It was just nice to be able to look at it, and it led me into looking at how feelings arise and then what happens after that. And recently I've been studying the book on the three principal aspects of the path for this group in Coeur d'Alene. And Geshe Sonam Rinchen talks about the feeling component, and he relates it to the three kinds of suffering. And it helped me to think about this a little bit, so I thought I'd share some of what he said, because sometimes when I look at the self-centered thought, it's kind of a big quagmire and a big mess, and I find it helpful to use some of the tools that we've been given to help kind of tease things out and see really what's going on. And so in the Buddha's teachings, they identify that we have these three feelings that come up whenever we come into contact with something, and that actually the feeling component in our mind is always present in every moment of mind. So we're having either a pleasant or unpleasant or a kind of a neutral feeling come up when we contact things that we hear, things that we see, all the different senses, and even the mental component, and they each have their own going on there. And what Geshe Sonam Rinchen explains is that, and he does it in the context of these three sufferings, the suffering of like pain, overt pain, the suffering of change, that things that we're enjoying end, and then we suffer when they end. And then the suffering, all the pervasive, conditioned, or compounded suffering, which is would be another talk, so I'm not going to get into that today. But in terms of these feelings, when pleasurable feelings arise, it very easily leads us into attachment to things. And we'll start then exaggerating the good qualities of things. And when unpleasant feeling arises, we'll very easily slide into getting angry about things, because we'll exaggerate the negative component of things. And then neutral feelings, when they arise, they actually can lead to confusion, because we'll do things like we'll take things that are impermanent and see them as permanent and things like that. And this thing about the neutral feelings, when he explains that, I found it kind of interesting, because he relates the neutral feeling with this compounded pervasive suffering, and he uses it almost as a proof. And so what he says is, the surest sign that your body and mind holds the seeds of the disturbing emotions, or holds the seeds of the afflictions and of suffering or dukkha, is the fact that even the most minor circumstance can precipitate both. And that is the case. We're just kind of going along during the day, nothing much happening. We're kind of in that neutral. And then the slightest little thing happens, and boom, things change. And that, he's saying, that's the surest sign that indicates that we have these seeds within us. And I think that's actually very true. And so what he's saying is that we need to actually recognize when these different feelings are arising, and recognize the process, and then focus on interrupting it so it doesn't move forward, going from feeling into something that's in a state of suffering. And that's something that we can do. And actually, Lama Tsongkhapa says, is once we, for instance, with the pleasant sensations, once we recognize that those are actually a form of suffering, our attachment to them will end, because we'll be more realistic. Right now, when we have a pleasant feeling, we're just like, bring it on, we want more, and we then set ourselves up for a big disappointment. But as this holiness says, if you just see it, oh, this is a small suffering just arising, then your mind will stay kind of more balanced about it, because you won't let it run off into the pleasure zone and get yourself all worked up and then the whole thing falls apart, as it's going to do, right? And the same thing with when when the unpleasant feelings come up. What he says here I found quite helpful Geshe Sonam Rinpoche, he says, try not to allow those to make your mind go to anger by remembering that your body and mind are a mass of causes which produce suffering at the slightest provocation. And when you're in the experience of something unpleasant happening, and then your mind going into aversion or anger, you're actually not thinking about any of this. You're not thinking about this. Your inappropriate attention is just making up a story now that is going to make the whole situation worse. Whereas what we could do is practice this is why they do the 4 foundations of mindfulness, I think, is practice kind of hanging out, redirecting your attention to the feeling and seeing what the unpleasantness is, and then remembering that, wow, this is all these causes and conditions happening here. This is a way that we can learn how to practice with these things. So I thought his advice there was really good. And he, in the analogy when they talked about these 3 sufferings and these pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, they use this analogy of having a boil on your body, and how if you have a boil that's really inflamed, if someone just touches it, it really hurts. So that's the painful feeling and the suffering of pain. And if they have if you put something cool on it, it will temporarily be pleasant because the pain is diminished, right? And then, but the one of the neutral is the one that interests me the most. It's kind of like you're just a boil all the time, walking around all day, just waiting for something to bump into something that's going to make you go from neutral to something else, right? And so that's, I think, a way that we can think about how, rather than just spacing out when things are neutral, being more aware. This is the kind of things that we can be mindful of, and then I think these things can help us quite a bit. And so then, because he puts this in the context of the 3 principal aspects of the path, then what we want to try to do is then really widen the picture, and then this is where we get into from yesterday, the self-centered thought is our biggest culprit that won't let us generate compassion and love and bodhicitta. It's like the opposite of bodhicitta in these things. So if we can kind of put this in a bigger perspective and realize that the sufferings that we undergo, the things that we get self-centered about and all worked up about, these can be, instead of leading to more self-centeredness, they can actually be leading us into this kind of recognition of how futile these things are and becoming disenchanted, which is how we generate this determination to be free from these problems, is understanding them. And when we have it in that context, then we can look around and this will help us to really develop compassion for others, because we'll be understanding our own situation, and then we can just easily go, wow, look at everybody's in the same situation, and help us to generate a mind of compassion and bodhicitta. So may we learn these tools and try to put them into gear as we can.